Composition theory. Okay, let's talk about composition. Composition can be quite difficult to understand, but hopefully I can break it down for you so you get better understanding of how to compose your own artwork. So composition means the arrangement of elements within artwork. So it's how you arrange your page. There are lots of different composition structures. Here are a few: Steelyard, S, diagonal, O or circle composition, the rule of thirds, golden ratio, L shape, leading lines, and triangle composition. Considering your composition will help to make your work effective and engaging to the viewer. Let's take a look at some of these individually. Okay, the golden ratio. So proportion can be used for aesthetic effect as well as for realism. The golden ratio is proportion that occurs in nature. It reflects the rate and pattern in which many things grow, such as shells, plants, and even galaxies. And here you can see a perfect example of the golden ratio shown in The Great Wave by Hokusai. So this painting, you can see how the spiral of the golden ratio begins in the top of the wave, circles round, and then up into the ocean. So the idea is that your eye is drawn to the centre of the spiral, and then it's carried round into the rest of the painting. And again, you can see some examples here of a fern that's growing there, and a shell, the spiral of the inside of a shell as well. So the idea is that the golden ratio is based on nature. Okay, the next example I have for you is, hopefully you're going to know this painting. This is the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, and this is a brilliant example again of the golden ratio. You can see that the focal point is in the centre of the face, and it spirals out and round above the top of her head, and then down her shoulder, and across down to her arms or her hands, which are overlapped on the arm of a chair, I presume. So the idea is, when you look at the Mona Lisa, the first thing your eye is drawn to is the centre of her face. Same with the wave. The first thing you probably look at when you look at the wave is the top of the wave and the more detailed area of the wave. Rule of thirds is a simplified version of the golden ratio. So the rule of thirds splits an image into thirds vertically and horizontally, as shown in these grids here. Artists will often separate the foreground and background content by using the horizontal lines that overlap. So if you take a look at the examples on the screen, you can see anywhere there's a red dot, this is a focal point of the painting. So if we look at this top left image here, you can see how the plane in the background is a focal point, and then in the foreground some figures there are also a focal point. So when you look at this painting without the grid, first things your eye will be drawn to are the figures and then the plane in the background. And again, the portrait there, I mean, you could argue that this is also the golden ratio composition, where the focal point is the centre of the face, which then circles round. But equally, the rule of thirds means that the top horizontal line, you can see there's a focal point on his right near his ear, and then that is drawn down. And again, still life at the bottom of the page, you can see the focal point is on the fruit, and then on the vessel there as well. And it's just the way that your eye is drawn around a canvas or a painting. Equally for abstract art as well, the same rules apply for abstract art and for photography. Okay, let's talk Steelyard composition. So steelyard composition is a large mass counterbalanced by an imaginary fulcrum by a smaller mass further away from the centre. So if you take a look at my diagram here, you can see how we've got a slightly bigger rectangular area on the right, and then on the left is slightly smaller. And I have some examples for you. So if you take a look at these landscapes, you'll see how we've got one larger mass on one side and then a smaller mass on the other side. So the idea is that a viewer's eye will be led into the artwork by looking at the largest, most detailed or lightest element first. The smaller mass will then guide the viewer's eye further into the artwork. This can also create a leading line, which we'll talk about in a little while. The O composition, or is sometimes referred to as the circle composition, is a dominant open space formed into a circle or an ellipse shape, usually in the centre of the page, but not necessarily, that's not the rule. And here we have some examples of that. So the idea is that a viewer's eye will be led into the artwork by looking at the circular focal point and then work away from this point to look at the rest of the composition, but always return back to this area. So my two exemplar pieces here, you can see there's this big open area in the first example in the middle there, and that's just that's the light hitting the surface of the sea, and then your eye is gradually drawn around the edge of that onto the rocks around and then into the sea there. And then the bottom right example, there's an ellipse shape, and again that's of water. But when you look at this painting, your eye is generally drawn to that area there before it starts to move around the rest of the painting and take in the rest of the detail. S composition. So a line or open area creates an S shape within the artwork. And I have some exemplars here. So the idea is a viewer's eye will be led into the artwork at the foreground and be guided by following the S shape into the background. So my two exemplars again are sea pieces, or I think that's a lake or a river. But you can see how when you first look at those paintings, the first thing you are probably going to look at is the foreground, and then your eye is then going to be guided round by the S shape leading into the background. Diagonal composition. So a line or a series of lines that run diagonally across artwork. So the idea is that a viewer's eye will be led into the artwork at the largest element and be guided by following the diagonal line towards the background. So if you take a look at my exemplar pieces here, you'll see how it's very clear that there's this diagonal sort of line. In the middle example there, we've got the mountains, and you can see they run down at a diagonal line. When I first look at that painting, my eye is definitely drawn to the higher mountain on the left-hand side, and then it comes down. And then you could also argue that this has got some of the S composition as well there, because it's got the river leading right round as well. So there is no rule. It's worth mentioning that you may use more than one of these techniques when you're designing a piece. You may not even necessarily consider the type of composition you're trying to create, and it may only be accidental that you've actually created a particular composition. You may just realise that your composition works, and that's absolutely fine. But if you're creating a piece of artwork and it's not working and you're not sure why, then it's worth revisiting this PowerPoint, taking a look at the compositions, and then perhaps you'll understand what you could do to improve your work.